when it comes to the epigraphic record, we do have the name or variants of the name Ishmael, actually, both in the north and the south. We have, I think, 100 instances, in fact, mostly in Safavidic, but some in South Arabian inscriptions as well. But we don't know if this is the biblical Ishmael, because, you know, the theophoric names ending in il, you know, appear in Safavidic or in other languages, Semitic languages. You know, we have, I don't know, Garm il, or Nasr-il or something. So Yisma'il could be just another theophoric name that was independently used by these people. In fact, it's possible that the Bible, the writers of the Bible, used the name Ishmael because maybe some people living in modern-day Jordan claimed that their ancestor is named Ishmael. You know, maybe that's how they drafted them to the family tree that they were coming up with.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Real Talk podcast with Tehran and Roxana. Today, we're excited to host Dr. Mohsen Goudarzi, Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies at Harvard Divinity School. His work focuses on the intellectual and social aspects of Islam's emergence, particularly the Quran's relationship with late antique literature and its textual history. In this episode, we'll be discussing his 2019 paper titled The Ascent of Ishmael, which explores the significance of biblical genealogy in the Quran. In it, he argues that the Quran anchors the Prophet Muhammad's mission to his community's descent from Abraham through Ishmael and critiques recent studies that downplay the genealogical aspect. The paper also examined Ishmael's contrasting portrayal in the Quran and pre-Islamic writings, as well as challenging the view that Abraham and Ishmael's role in Islam's development are solely Medinan constructs. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Goudarzi.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
And I hope we're not a little late to the party by inviting you for an article that you published in 2019. I mean, you have many more recent articles that are just as interesting, and we recommend people to go and read those. But considering that I've interviewed Robert Hoyland, and we talked about his book In God's Path a bit, and I also interviewed Peter Webb on his book Imagining the Arabs, and you seem to engage with those two works in this article, I thought it would be coming of us to invite you for this one.
Thank you.
And so our first question to kick off our discussion, what inspired you to write this article on the significance of Abrahamic genealogy in the Quran, and specifically on the Prophet Muhammad's descent from Ishmael as an organizing principle in Islam's emergence?
Thank you. So I was working on I was finishing my dissertation, which is about the Quran's conception of scriptural and prophetic history. And one of the arguments that I had made in the dissertation, which now I'm hoping to turn into a book, I'm working on it as we speak. One of my arguments was that the Quran envisions only two comprehensive scriptures, two paradigmatic scriptures to have been sent down. One is the Torah, which is the first kitab. So the term kitab is almost like a technical term in my reading of the Quran. So we have the first kitab and the Torah, and then there's the second kitab, which is the Quran. So, you know, the book of Psalms and the gospel are scriptures, but they're not kitabs in my reading of the Quran. And so there's these two towering moments of prophetic history and scriptural history when God sends a comprehensive paradigmatic scripture down to two different prophets. And so one of the questions was that, you know, after this analysis, one of my questions was, well, why two? Why, if this is a reasonable reading of the Quran, why do we have two comprehensive scriptures and not three, not four, not five? Mm. And so in the course of trying to make sense of this, I came to the conclusion that it is really the Abrahamic primary audience of these kitabs, these comprehensive scriptures, that explains why there's two of them. So God gives the first kitab to the Israelites, you know, the main branch of Abraham's family, and now he's giving the second kitab to the Ishmaelites. And there are two kitabs because they're, you know, Abraham's family at least as recounted in the Quran, he has two sons, and it's Abraham and Ishmael, and the Ishmaelites had been bereft of this incredible gift of comprehensive religious guidance and enlightenment. So God is giving them now, after all these years, giving them their own kitab in their own language, sent by a prophet who is from their own ranks. And so then that raised the question of, thinking more closely and looking more closely at the significance of genealogy in the Quran, and to what extent, Abraham and Ishmael function as kind of explanatory, both organizing principles in the sense that, you divide the world using certain categories. So there are genealogy is a category with which the Quran is dividing humans and making sense of history and the world, but also that their incredible gifts and their election by God really explains why the first kitab is given to that community and the second one to this community.
Okay, like as I mentioned in the introduction, you engage with a number of scholars, and you open your essay on Abrahamic Ishmaelite genealogy in the Quran by critiquing a number of recent studies by academics such as Fred Donner and Peter Webb, who downplay or deny its significance, Abrahamic Ishmaelite genealogy, and characterize Islam as a movement with universal aspirations that exhorted militarist expansion. What arguments and evidence do these scholars use to support this thesis?
Very good question. So let me first say that I do like all of those studies. So, the fact that I disagree with this particular aspect of them is not really, doesn't have bearing on the general merit of those studies. I've read them multiple times. I assign them still in my classes, and I think they're really great studies. But I felt that they do not do justice to the genealogical aspect of the Quran's preaching. And I think the reason that happens is that the genealogical aspect is not very explicit always in the Quran. So you have to kind of be very careful and not miss any of the references, but also because throughout the centuries, the Quran has not been read as a very specifically genealogically oriented document. Even from the earliest works of tafsir or commentary, scholars were writing, in a vast empire from a multiplicity of ethnicities, and they were really reading their own Islamic community into the Quran in a way, and their Islamic community was not one of Ishmaelites. It was just much broader and much bigger. And also the Quran in general, as we all know, is not really into providing a lot of details all the time. Even when it's addressing the Prophet and his community, it doesn't really habitually refer to them as Quraysh. When you read the Constitution of Medina, you see all those specificities right there. Quraysh and Ansar and Banu this and Banu that, Banu Najjar, Banu Jusham, so on and so forth. But the Quran generally refrains from providing these specificities. So it's really easy to miss this aspect of it. But I think if you look closer, it's hard to miss. And I think the other reason that the genealogical aspect has kind of fell out of favor is, again, because when people are writing about Muslims and the Quran as the scripture of Muslims, I don't know, it may seem even distasteful to raise this question, because then scholars would be saying, well, most Muslims do not fall under the category of the Ishmaelites, so maybe you're not the primary audience of the Quran. You could be maybe the secondary or tertiary audience, but not the primary one. So there could be a host of reasons. I would say the Quran's general discourse is probably the first one, but there's other, the commentary tradition and some modern realities also probably explain why this is not something that has been really taken into account in some of these recent studies.
I even want to say that it seems like, and I could be wrong, that some, even the average Muslim even kind of downplay genealogy by citing the Prophet's last sermon that, race doesn't really matter, right? Really doesn't factor into things more so than piety. And the fact that it's not mentioned in the Quran, and I know we'll probably talk about this later, you know, I just wonder if Ishmaelite ancestry was just commonly understood. And as with the Quran not going into detail with many biblical stories, because some people assume that the first audience already understood the details of these stories. I wonder if the Ishmaelite genealogy was also the same way, that the Quran really didn't need to go into details. It was already commonly understood. And then, yeah, and we'll discuss more about that later.
Yes, that makes sense. And I think, the other question that we can ask is, to what, if Ishmaelite genealogy is of importance in the Quran, does it mean that our everyday people felt strongly that this is a big part of their identity, or is the Quran trying to make it a bigger part of their identity? So that's also a little bit difficult to assess. As you noted, we're probably going to discuss this in more detail. But there's also this question of, the Quran, to what extent does it represent the kind of broader beliefs and commitments of all of the Prophet's followers? And that can be a little bit tricky to answer.
Definitely.
You talk about Donner and Webb, and you critique some of their ideas in terms of their ideas of the sort of universal ecumenical concept of Islam at the early stages of it. And you compare it to Robert Hoyland's analysis, and you point out some differences. How do these scholars differ, although they all come to sort of a very similar conclusion?
Yeah, very good question. So one of the main differences between them is that Fred Donner and also Peter Webb to some extent, but mostly Fred Donner, they really tried to argue that the main impetus behind the rise of Islam and the conquests, more specifically, the main impetus was religious and ideological, that this was, a very conscious move to conquer territories, as Tehran pointed to kind of establish, with a militant piety, establish the rule of God's law on the whole earth. And that's why they set out to conquer all these territories. And, so that's Donner's explanation, heavily leans into the religious and ideological aspect. Whereas Robert Hoyland, I think, as a very socially grounded and social and economic and military historian, as well as an intellectual historian, he feels that that may be, too much of a projection onto what was happening on the ground, and that, a lot of people were motivated by material considerations, maybe by some ethnic considerations. So he's more open to look into those as impetuses and impulses behind the conquest. What's really interesting is that nevertheless, the idea that the earliest movement represents some sort of ecumenical movement open to Jews and Christians is actually, to some extent, if we trace the genealogy of that idea, it really starts with Hagarism to some extent, because Hagarism makes the argument that the very earliest phase of Islam was Judeo-Hagarism. That's what they call it in their chapter in the book, Judeo-Hagarism, because there were these communities of Ishmaelite descendants and Hagar's descendants, and they joined together with some Jews who had fled maybe Roman persecution, and they banded together and they moved basically for the Holy Land. And so there's this notion of they were almost equal partners, and they use, in fact, the Constitution of Medina to support this argument. They generally don't rely on the Quran, but they do use the Constitution of Medina, which does represent, some sort of alliance between some of the Prophet's followers, or at least all of the Prophet's followers, and some of the Jews of Yathrib, perhaps. So the idea of, this kind of close, the Jews at least being part of the movement, really goes back to Hagarism in a very substantive way. And then Robert Hoyland later on, again, much before Fred Donner's book or even his article in 2001, I think, the 2001 article of Donner, I mean, but Robert Hoyland in the 90s wrote an article trying to see to what extent we can still defend some version of this thesis of some sort of Jewish and Ishmaelite alliance. I think it's called Sabaeus. It has Sabaeus in the title. So he actually makes a very similar argument to what Donner makes later, a few years later, that, you know, when the Quran talks about believers, maybe this includes, you know, Jews and Christians, as well as the prophet's followers. So in fact, I think in the Genesis, if we trace this idea in its Genesis, Hoyland himself has played a role, and he is kind of open also to this, to some sort of ecumenical dimension. So on that, actually, I think, even though he doesn't present it as his own idea, but rather as Donner's idea. So he's open to that, but he also wants to pay a lot of attention to the material aspect of things. I forgot to say something about the previous question, if you don't mind me going back to it, of why, you know, it's easy to maybe miss the genealogical aspect. And one is that when you read the Quran, when the Quran talks about Jews, or when the Quran talks about Christians, or when the Quran talks about Muslims, again, because it is not providing any of these specificities, it's just so easy for us to map them onto our conception of what does a Jewish community mean for us. They come, you know, yes, maybe they're more genealogically oriented, but they could come from multiple communities in the world, and especially Christians. The Christians come from all over the universe, and Muslims too. So we kind of tend to map them onto the Quranic text, whereas the Quranic text may be addressing a reality that's very different. And to be Jewish, to be Christian has very different meanings, or to be a follower of the prophet has a very different meaning. But, you know, it's just easy to miss that aspect.
One phrase that you use to describe this scholarship, this sort of genre of scholarship in your article, is a reverse kenosis. You say the effect of this scholarship is a reverse kenosis. I found that expression really interesting. Could you explain what that is?
Yes, so I was borrowing, and I hope it was not disrespectful of me to borrow a Christian theological concept, which is the idea of when the incarnation happens, God, or the Son of God, has to almost empty himself of some divine privileges and prerogatives to take on a human form. So it's kind of pushing aside some of your divine powers and privileges. And I think it goes back to St. Paul in Philippians, where he says, you know, try to be humble like Christ, who emptied himself. And so that's what kenosis generally refers to. I felt that what we see in some of these studies is the reverse kenosis, in the sense that we empty Quranic references and categories of their earthly or material aspect or groundedness, and so we turn them into abstract and transcendental categories. So that's what I was referring to. And one of them is that, you know, goes back to genealogy. You know, when the Quran, I think, when the Quran talks about Jews and even Christians, as some other scholars have also noted, it is still seeing them primarily as Israelites, two branches within the history of Israel, really. So there's a kind of genealogical specificity, or the prophet's followers. Yes, the Quran oftentimes just generally refers to them as believers, but they are believers from the prophet's people, just as when the Quran is relating the stories of previous prophets, it tells us that some of the community of that prophet believed, some of them did not believe, and so the believers were saved by God, the unbelievers were punished. So it doesn't mean that they were a global community of believers. You know, they were from the people of Shu'aib, or they were from the people of Saleh, or they were from people of Hud, or they were from people of Pharaoh. You know, the Quran talks about the mu'minun min ali Fir'aun, a believer from the people of Pharaoh. So when the Quran addresses the prophet's followers and talks about believers, it is not talking about believers regardless of their background. It is really saying of those of you who have believed, you know, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. So you were not really part of this group. Then you made a conscious decision to adopt belief in God and the last day and the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet of God. So it has a specificity that is easy to miss. And this is across the board the case, I think. Think about all the, so I've worked recently on the question of the cultic aspect of the Quran and the Prophet's preaching. And let's say, you know, we read Surah Al-Kafirun. It says, you know, O unbelievers, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ. I do not serve what you serve. وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. And you do not serve what I serve. You do not worship what I worship. And we just, you know, read across them. We don't even think twice. But what exactly does serving mean here? You know, we often tend to just think about the kind of theological or doctrinal aspect, that they considered certain beings God, and the Prophet was not considering or deeming them gods. But this is talking about a verb, لا أعبد ما تعبدون. What exactly does it mean that I do not serve what you serve? How did they serve their gods? The Quran really doesn't give a lot of information. Or when the Quran elsewhere talks about you know, لا تدعوا مع الله إلها آخر. Do not invoke a God with Allah. What does that mean? What does invocation mean in this context? What does dua mean? Is it just a private prayer, or is it more than that? Is there a cultic context, basically? Think about the Meccan sanctuary. People go there. It's a public space of worship. They are invoking the name of multiple deities, and the Quran is saying, no, 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 you can't do that to Prophet. And it's a public thing because they're rubbing shoulders and they get into conflicts. And so the Prophet says, look, I'm not going to worship the gods that you are worshiping. And so there's oftentimes, I think, this reverse kenosis, as it were, the kind of emptying out of the material aspect that happens with the genealogical dimension, with the cultic dimension, as I've tried to argue. And then also, even in other respects, I think Karen Bauer and Faraz Hamza have a really wonderful book recently out about women and households in the Quran. They argue, again, that oftentimes the Quran's exhortations towards charity, toward, you know, its legislation about, you know, how men should treat women, how women should treat men, that they are unfolding in a certain social context with certain assumptions and certain ways of organizing society that the Quran really doesn't talk about, because going back to Tehran's point that, you know, people just knew about it, you know, they were living in this community and they knew about it, but the Quran doesn't talk about it. Let me just end with this example. An American example from, let's say somebody says, you know, let's go over the speeches of Senator Bernie Sanders. And let's say that Bernie Sanders was tended to be in his speeches not very specific in policy. I mean, he sometimes is, but let's just pretend that, like the Quran, he tended to, at least in his fiery speeches, not really get into the details of policy. And so what did he care about? Well, he cared about justice and fairness. He cared about them big time. But these are not just abstract values to Bernie Sanders. Justice and fairness actually mean very specific things when it comes to the tax code, for example. You know, tax the millionaires and the billionaires in a certain way, or tax the big companies in a certain way, or support, you know, child care expenses for underprivileged communities in a certain way. So it has very specific meanings. But then when he's, you know, just talking about the greed, the corporate greed, the millionaires and the billionaires, the oligarchy and the justice, it's easy to miss that there's actually a very specific set of policy recommendations in mind. So I think same with the Quran, when it's saying, do not worship those, worship only Allah, these have very specific implications. Or when it's talking about, you know, the prophets or the different peoples to whom God has given prophecy and scripture or kitab, it has, again, very specific kind of communities and a division of humanity in mind upon which this narrative is basically based and unfolds.
So obviously this emptying out of specificity that you're talking about here, the sort of emptying out of the of context to a certain extent. Why do you find the scholars' rejection of the specific genealogical implications of certain Quranic verses? Why do you find it so untenable based on your reading of those verses?
Very good. So there are two reasons basically why I think we should not downplay or forget about the genealogical aspect. One of them is just the Quranic text itself. That's the most important one. That I think if we actually look at the Quranic text, especially some of the surahs, because this does not arise in all the surahs, but in some of the surahs it's clearer to see than others, then we'll see that there's the genealogy really matters. So if we think about the Israelites, I think the Quran is very clear. It is not really the case that ties of family don't matter at all. No, they do matter. Yes, faith trumps, as in the Khutbatul Wada' that you pointed to, Tehran. Faith does trump family ties. I think that's absolutely correct. In the Quran also it does that, but it doesn't render them meaningless, or it doesn't destroy them. It just takes priority over them, and so, when the Quran says, Inna Allah hastafa, God chose, Inna Allah hastafa Adama wa Nuh wa ala Ibrahim wa ala Imran ala al-alamin. God chose Adam and Noah, and then specifically, ala Ibrahim wa ala Imran, the family of Abraham and the family of Imran ala al-alamin. It's really talking about families. It's really thinking about the children of Abraham, the children of Imran, and then it says ذُرِّيَّةً بَعْضُهَا مِنْ بَعْضٍ. So there's a ذُرِّيَّة, there's a progeny. Some of them overlap with others. Clearly, the family relationship of the prophets to Abraham matters a great deal. The giving of Isaac and Jacob to Abraham matters a great deal. The relation between Solomon and David matters a great deal. The relation between Aaron and Moses matters a great deal. So family actually matters a lot. It's not meaningless. So that's just a general thing, that when the Quran talks about Abraham, especially because all the prophets are really from Abraham's family, all the Anbiya that are mentioned are from Abraham's family. And in Surah Al-An'am, there's a long list of them. They're all Abraham's family. It's not just kind of random people from all over the world. We're talking about a very specific branch. And then when we come to some other surahs of the Quran, which in particular Surah 2, but also a passage in Surah Ibrahim and, Surah Al-Hajj, again, it's very clear that Abraham's descent from Abraham is a very potent claim. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the longest surah in the Quran, probably the most important surah when it comes to almost announcing the coming of age of the believers as a distinct community, genealogy is really absolutely central to the surah. And we can see this, first of all, when the surah talks about the others from Abraham's family, it refers to them sometimes as the children of Israel. That's very clear. Ya Bani Israel, that's clear. Sometimes it just says Ya Ahl al-Kitab, or Yahud wa Nasara. And these are really interchangeable, which again, I think shows us that, we shouldn't think when the Quran says Jews and Christians, we shouldn't think about our context, or even the reality of that world, which is, Christians are coming from all over the world, but the Quran is really looking at it from a very specific vantage point. So Jews and Christians, or the people of the book, they are Israelites, basically. They are used interchangeably with Ya Bani Israel. And then when it comes to the Prophet's family, the Prophet's followers and people, again, we see that genealogy matters a great deal because of the very conscious way in which the Abraham segment, as I call it, in the middle of the surah, works. And I think it's a very artful construction. I don't know if you want me to talk about it now or later, But basically what happens is, if you think about how the Bible, how a lot of works from the Jewish tradition present the history of the Israelites, they begin with Abraham.
Right.
They begin with Abraham. The history of Israel begins with Abraham. Because he is the one with whom God entered into a covenant. He is the one whose righteousness basically moved God to grant all these wonderful gifts, the gift of land, the gift of numerous descendants, on his descendants, on Abraham's family. So that's how basically you would find it in the Bible, or you would find it in some of the shorter stories. I forget, I think Joshua has this speech before entering the land where he says, when the Lord chose Abraham, your forefather, and moved him from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran and so on. So the story of Israel begins with Abraham. But in Al-Baqarah, what's very interesting is the story of Abraham is excised from the story of Israel. The story of Israel does not begin with the story of Abraham. It is the story of the Ishmaelites that begins with the story of Abraham. The story of Israel, which appears in the first half of the surah, is preceded by the story of Adam and Eve, which is basically the story of another covenant gone wrong. It's not a completely hopeless situation, because God eventually has mercy on Adam and Eve and teaches them how to repent towards him. And also for the Israelites, it's not a totally hopeless story, because the passage begins and ends by saying basically, Ya Bani Israel, adhkuru ni'mati allati an'amtu alaykum. Be reminded of, or remember the ni'mah, the graces, the favors that I have bestowed upon you. وَأَوْفُوا بِعَهْدِي أُوفِ بِعَهْدِكُمْ. Hold on to your side of the covenant so that I keep holding on to my side of the covenant. So there is still hope. They can still, rescue their compromised covenantal relationship with God. But then the surah goes on to talk about Abraham.
It sounds like you're going to answer our next, really, I mean, we were just going to let you cook, because you were really going into our next question, which is, how do you think the Abraham segment of the surah you're talking about, Al-Baqarah, contributes thematically and structurally to the theological aims of Surah Al-Baqarah?
Yes, exactly. So after, talking about the Israelites and the many acts of unfaithfulness that they, or at least a majority of them, or at least many of them have committed, because the Quran is sometimes very careful. It doesn't say always all of them, kathiran minhum, many of them have committed. Then the surah has this very interesting flashback to Abraham. And it shows Abraham being tested by God, and he's successful in his tests. And then God says, I will appoint you as an imam for people. And the first thing that Abraham says is, what about my children? Abraham cares deeply about his children, right? قَالَ وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي. What about my children? And then God says, my covenant, عهدي, لا ينال عهدي الظالمين. My covenant will not extend to or encompass the evildoers. This is not a negation of progeny. It's just that, being Abraham's progeny does not automatically confer on you, some sort of special relationship with God. You have to really work for it. It enables that, but you have to work for it.
I was just going to say, obviously, in the example of Noah's son.
Exactly. So even if you are, part of the family of a prophet like Noah's son, you cannot be a recipient of salvation if you're not listening to God, or Abraham's father, or Lot's wife and Noah's wife, as the Quran talks about them. So Abraham cares about his dhurriyyah, and God says, well, they have to be, they can't be unjust. As long as they are just, they can be covered. And then Abraham, what happens in the following verses? It's really Abraham sitting with his family, and it's really his family. Yeah, bunayya, وَوَصَّى بِهَا إِبْرَاهِيمُ بَنِيهِ وَيَعْقُوبُ. So Abraham exhorted or commanded his sons, as did Jacob, right? Remain monotheists, to worship God in the proper way. So it's really, I would say, this is like Edenic. It's like Eden finally, because Adam and Eve were not successful. But this is a great situation. Abraham and his sons are sitting there, and they're all great people. So finally, something is working. But what happens after that? Well, first of all, the Quran says you cannot lay claim, probably to the Israelites. The Quran says you can't just lay claim to this perfect community of the patriarchs. تِلْكَ أُمَّةٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ. This is a community that has gone before you, and لَهَا مَا كَسَبَتْ وَلَهُمْ مَا كَسَبْتُمْ. They have the reward of what they have done, and you will have the reward of what you have done. You can't just say, because we have this doctrine of the Zechot Avot in the Jewish tradition of the righteousness of the fathers, really, that explains God's special treatment of the Jewish people. And the Quran is probably pushing back against this. So it's not negating genealogy and its significance, but it's just saying that, you can't lay automatic claim to it. And then what happens after this, it's really the story of Abraham and Ishmael. And Abraham and Ishmael build the house, and وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمُ الْقَوَاعِدَ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ وَإِسْمَاعِيلُ. They both raise the foundations of the house, and then they pray. And then again, what do they pray for? They pray for their dhurriya, right? They pray for dhurriya. رَبَّنَا وَجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكَ. Make us Muslims for you. And I think back in the time when I was writing the article, I translated as submitters to you. But now I would say basically monotheists, or people who worship you monotheistically, because it's responding, I think, to some criticism by some Jews and Christians that these are pagan rites that you were doing. And the Quran is saying, no, 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 they're not pagan rites. The Meccan sanctuary was founded by Abraham and Ishmael, who explicitly say, by the way, we are going to worship only the one God here. وَجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكَ. Make us Muslims for you. Make us people who devote their worship wholly and exclusively to you. وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِنَا أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. And from our children, from our progeny, a monotheist community for you. So it's going to respond also to Jews and Christians who would say you're compromising monotheism by worshiping in this particular way. And then it goes on to say, and send among them a prophet from one of them who would teach them, يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ, would teach them the kitab and hikmah. So it's all based on the prayer of Abraham and Ishmael that is fulfilled in the Prophet Muhammad and in God's giving of the Quran to him. So I think the surah, is very artful. It doesn't say, well, descent doesn't matter at all. Let's not talk about this. We are all Abraham's children in spirit if we follow him, which is something close to the argument that St. Paul makes. No, the Quran goes to another line of Abraham's children and raises the significance of Ishmael. So that's why I think it's very important. Elsewhere also we have this concern in Surah 14, Surah Ibrahim. We have Abraham. What does he do? He brings some of his dhurriya. رَبَّنَا أَسْكَنْتُ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي. I have settled some of my dhurriya. بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ. In a barren valley. عِنْدَ بَيْتِكَ الْمُحَرَّمِ. By your sacred house. رَبَّنَا, O Lord. لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. And that's also significant, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. So that they establish salat. And salat is really important. So Abraham brings some of his family by God's sacred house. So the familial aspect is there. Elsewhere, again, I think, in Surah Al-Hajj, مِلَّةَ أَبِيكُمْ Ibrahim. By performing worship in this particular way, you are following the right and the way of your father Abraham. So I think it's significant. It's especially clear in when it comes to the question of Ishmael's significance. It's especially clear in Al-Baqarah, in Surah Ibrahim, and to some extent in Hajj, but I think it's also clear even in Meccan surahs that he's significant, and I'm sure we'll talk about it.
I guess considering all of what you just mentioned is why you believe the Abraham segment, if that was the only place to mention Ishmael, that would be sufficient to establish him as a critical figure. But still, I can't help but ask the question, if the figure of Ishmael was so integral to the early Muslim identity, why is he mentioned on fewer occasions than other prophetic figures in the Quran?
Very good. So one answer. So first of all, I would again express my suspension of judgment as to what extent Ishmaelite identity was very strongly felt by the Prophet's followers in general, as opposed to something that the Quran is using for specific theological and polemical aims, basically. So I honestly don't know if, let's say, the Prophet's Sahaba, how strongly they, before Islam, how strongly they felt about this. But what's clear to me is that the Quran is trying to make it a bigger part of their identity, certainly. So that's what I would say. And the second point is that it's really Abraham who is significant and not Ishmael. Ishmael is just a bridge to Abraham. So, just as, I mean, you could say in the Jewish tradition, less so, I would say, but in the Jewish tradition also, it's Abraham who is the star of the show, and then to some extent, in the next one, kind of Jacob, and Isaac is, yes, important, but really serves as a bridge, so to speak. And so I think that's partly that just, it's really Abraham who is the star of the show, and everything is flowing from Abraham. Prestige flows from Abraham. So it's really it's like, having your family tree and you're trying to lay claim to some sort of king. And, it's not really the immediate children who matter. I mean, you want to say good things about them because they're part of your line, but, it's really that, you want to trace yourself to the king. And so Abraham is not a king, but he's a patriarch, and he's the prophet, and he's a primary monotheist, and so on and so forth. So that's another reason I would say that it's important. And then the other one is also that although I think the Ishmaelite genealogy is important in the Quran, and I use the term organizing principle, it is something that with which the Quran makes sense of history, makes sense of the present. But it is not, election in that sense is not really central to the Quran as it is to the biblical tradition. It's just not like that. I think in the conclusion of the paper, I try to speak about this a little, that the relationship that the Quran envisages is much more transactional. In the Jewish tradition, there's a lot said about the covenant being eternal, God being in this special relationship for good, for eternity. But in the Quran, the relationship it's not just privileges, but also it's like with great power comes great responsibility. So it's not even necessarily desired. Like in me reading the Quran, I'm happy I'm not an Ishmaelite because my responsibilities will be higher probably. So it's just more is expected from people who are given all these gifts by God, because they now have to behave properly and to serve as examples and moral examples, imams, just as Abraham was appointed as an imam. They have to serve as moral exemplars for people. They have to share their knowledge of scripture with people. لَتُبَيِّنَنَّهُ لِلنَّاسِ. As the Quran elsewhere says that, we ask the people of the book, they have to explain the book for people, for other people. So there's a lot of responsibilities with that, and it's also transactional. So it's just not having the same function as Israelite descent has in the Bible.
Well, talking about how the Quran compares to the biblical literature quite a lot, you spend a good portion of your paper talking about how the positive portrayal of Ishmael as a righteous messenger and prophet represents quite a significant intervention in the history of biblical interpretation of Ishmael. Could you explain to us a little bit about how that mechanism takes place and how the Quran compares in the way it portrays Ishmael to the way Ishmael was depicted in in biblical literature?
Absolutely. So I'm glad you asked this question now, because it also goes back to some extent to, how do we assess the Meccan references to Ishmael? Because Ishmael does appear in Meccan surahs in a very positive way, but is not very clearly, at least in the earlier and so-called middle Meccan passages, if we go by that chronology, is not associated with Ishmael. Still, he's considered a very positive figure. And, if he was also a positive figure in Judaism and Christianity, then this would not be as significant. But if he was a largely negative figure in Judaism and Christianity, then this would be actually much more significant and would kind of support the argument that I'm making, which is that the Quran is almost like gradually raising his profile. So it begins by just saying positive things about him to extricate him from the kind of negative image that he has, and then actually challenges the notion of maybe election that the Israelites have in the late Meccan and early and the Medinan period. So our assessment of the significance of Meccan references to Ishmael depends to some extent, I would say to a large extent, on Ishmael, the discourse about Ishmael in Judaism and Christianity. And because that discourse is negative, as I'll explain further, that actually makes the Meccan positive references much more meaningful and significant. Now, what is Ishmael's status? Now, here I rely, largely on the work of other scholars, because I'm not a scholar of, the Bible primarily, or Jewish and Christian literature primarily. So I relied on Carol Backo's, she has a wonderful book, Ishmael at the Border, or on the Border, Rabbinic Portrayals of Ishmael. And there's other scholars. And since I've published a paper, I think there's been even more. I think there was like a massive book came out just after the paper was published that traces Ishmael's portrayals in all biblical literature down to late antiquity, if not later. So basically, the short story is that Ishmael is somebody who could have inherited Abraham's covenant, but did not. And God decided to go with Isaac. So he's prey to the so-called deflection of primogeniture that appears in the Bible several times, with Ishmael and Isaac, with Cain and Abel, with Esau and Jacob, and others as well. So Ishmael is the son of he's not a very negative figure in the Bible, but he's also not a very positive figure either. God does promise him certain things, especially God has regard for Hagar when she's thrown out, and promises her, or an angel of God promises her that Ishmael will be a great nation. He will be a wild ass of a man. He will be a ferocious man. His hand against everyone, everyone hands against him. There will be 12 princes from Ishmael. So some good things are about his potential are said. His character is not really developed, but he's just an outsider. And then he goes on and marries an Egyptian woman. He goes out living, in Mount Sinai, in the Sinai desert, in Paran, and so he's just out of the story basically for most of the rest of the Bible. But what happens is that in Judaism and Christianity, in both of them, for different reasons, Ishmael becomes a much more negative figure than he is in the actual text of Genesis. In the Jewish tradition, because of this emphasis on the election of the Israelites, there's much more willingness to say negative things about other communities and why they have not been chosen, why they have not been part of the covenant, why they have not received the Torah. And so I cover some of that in the paper. The Ishmaelites are associated with banditry in particular, because they're seen as the community of maybe nomadic peoples who are roaming the desert, and whose lifestyle basically means that sometimes they are performing these raids And so they are associated with banditry, which is one of the cardinal sins, because you shall not steal. And it's part of the Ten Commandments, but they do steal, and it's a part of their lives. And that's actually why God did not give them the Torah, because he wanted to give them the Torah, and they asked, what's in it? And God said, well, it says you shall not steal. And they were like, thank you, we don't want that. You can keep your Torah. And so there is, all sorts of things said about Ishmael playing with Isaac in the text of Genesis. What did that mean, playing with Isaac? Because that's when Sarah decides to throw Hagar out with her son, when she sees that Ishmael and Isaac are maybe getting too close, or maybe Ishmael is doing something to Isaac, and so the rabbis say, well, he was committing sexual transgressions, or he was committing idolatry, or he was violent, and so on. So there's a lot said of, just all of this is to consolidate the status of Israelites as God's chosen people. And that's, part of the rabbinic portrayal of Ishmael, largely negative. There's, I think, one positive reference that Carol Backhouse points to, which is that there were 4 people who were given their name before they were born, and Ishmael is one of them, and it's because they were righteous. So there's this one reference, but overwhelmingly it's negative. And then in the Christian tradition, because Paul really uses an ingenious argument to taint the law and to basically say that the law is not necessary, that the law is a form of bondage or slavery. And he says, think about it. Where was the law? Where was the Torah sent down? It was in Mount Sinai. Now, Mount Sinai is in Arabia, and it's the territory of the Ishmaelites. It's the territory of the descendants of the slave woman Hagar. So in fact, from the very beginning, this was imprinted. The servile connotations of the law are there in the place that it was sent down. So those who follow the law are really in reality, if not in the flesh, but in reality, they are Hagar's descendants and Ishmael's children. Whereas those who follow grace, they are the true sons of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. And so that becomes a big part of how subsequent Christian authors are thinking about the status of Ishmaelites. Again, oftentimes Ishmael is used in a negative way because it was so crucial that he be excluded from the covenant. Like that's something that becomes much more important in the Christian and Jewish tradition than it was maybe in the Bible. At least the Bible is not very wordy about it. So by and large, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, Ishmael has a negative status, which I would argue makes the Meccan positive Meccan references to him very meaningful.
And in your view, does this Quranic positive image of Ishmael, does it represent a sort of radical revision or remaking of the sort of the way the biblical tradition developed? Or is it actually sort of preserving an even earlier biblical tradition that wasn't known to these Jewish and Christian theologians who sort of developed this negative portrayal of Ishmael after his quite neutral portrayal in Genesis?
Yeah, excellent point. So it is possible that the Quran is here not kind of the first to raise the profile of Ishmael in a way, but maybe is preserving an earlier positive assessment, perhaps especially if Christianity had spread among the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, especially in the north, who were called by outsiders as Ishmaelites. Perhaps they had already come to see Ishmael in a more positive light. So it's possible that there is some kind of genealogy there that we're not able to see. But what the Quran does with Ishmael is very unique. Even if before the Quran there was some attempt to raise his profile, still there was no kind of comparable religious movement of Ishmael's children claiming to God's patrimony, claiming to have a scripture on par with the Torah, claiming to have, in fact, the first temple that God has appointed for people's worship that has been built by Ishmael. So the Quran is doing very specific things with the story of Ishmael and with Ishmaelite descent, which makes me think that even if there was a positive reappraisal of Ishmael, perhaps by people who considered themselves Ishmaelites and had converted to Christianity, that still what the Quran is doing goes way beyond that, because the distinct aims of the Quran, I can't quite see them happening before when there's no talk of a kind of scripture comparable to the Torah, for example. So that's what I would say.
Did early non-Muslim sources discussing the emergence of Islam accept the Quranic claim of an Abrahamic genealogy for the Prophet and his followers, or did they consider the Prophet to be the originator of this concept? Because I asked that, the reason why I asked that question is because, as what you mentioned, a lot of what we know of Arabs with Ishmaelite ancestry seems to be concentrated in the north. So I always wonder did the and a lot of the writings of non-Muslim writings that we have are concentrated up north as well. So I was wondering, like, did they see, oh no, the Prophet Muhammad way down in Hijaz, he couldn't have been Ishmaelite ancestry couldn't have spread so far down that way. We do know that the idea of Arab identity wasn't how we understand it today. It really wasn't a collective identity, even though we have records of people identifying as Arabs. So yeah, I just wondered, did they see it as a far-fetched, or was Muhammad just basically making things up, so to speak?
Right. Very good question. So it seems that they had no problem with it, because I don't think any of the texts that have been preserved, non-Muslim texts, whether Christian ones or Jewish ones, that talk about the earliest followers of the Prophet Muhammad, I don't think any of them has any kind of pushback against the idea that they are Ishmaelites. In fact, they call them Ishmaelites very often. This may in fact be the most common label, if it's at least one of the most common labels for the Prophet and his followers, if not the most common label in these works, whether you're looking at Christian sources or the few Jewish ones that we have. And it's not even clear that they are replicating the self-identity of the earliest Muslims. It's possible that they are replicating that, but it may even be that they're independently calling them Ishmaelites. But regardless of that, there is no pushback. They are just taking this for granted that these people are Ishmaelites. And in fact, they are using that, much like the Quran, to make sense of what is happening. Because, the Armenian source that we have, which it was wrongly attributed to Sabaeus, when he comes to telling the story of the rise of the Prophet's movement, he says, well, now let me tell you about this talk of Ishmael, about whom the prophecy was fulfilled, that his hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand will be against him. So this is why there's this conquest going on, so that's how this author makes sense of it. Of course, this was a prophecy in the book of Genesis. Now finally it's come true. Now finally they are laying hand on everybody and they're fighting everybody and everybody's fighting back, but they're not successful. So they use that just as a matter of fact. They don't contest it. As far as I know, nobody contests it. And that's actually another reason why I feel that when the Quran talks about the the significance of Ishmael, in fact, the outsider evidence also helps with that, because they converge. It's not just the Quran that's doing that. It's also non-Muslims who are doing that. And oddly enough, when Fred Donner and Peter Webb enumerate the different ways in which non-Muslims are referring to Muslims, they don't mention the genealogical designation, even though it's actually, I would say, probably the most common, if not the most common. It's definitely top two. It's very common, B'nai Ishmael, Ishmaeliah, or in Greek. In Greek also it's very common. So it's not just in Syriac, it's Greek. In Armenian we see. So across the board, and they just think, that's the case.
Well, okay, so how did 19th century Orientalists studying Islam approach the Quran's use of genealogy? What do you believe were their core weaknesses in their arguments and use of the sources? Because it seems like they, okay, no, never mind. I'm not going to put my foot in my mouth.
So, what's so interesting is that when you, and for this paper, I went back and read even 18th century, some 18th century works of scholarship and early 19th century works of scholarship. I was really curious to see when it was that, you know, scholars began to formulate some of the ideas that then later on became common. So I was interested in the origin of some of these ideas. And it seems to me that even by the 19th century, by the early 19th century, even mid-19th century, most European scholars are still using the Bible to make sense of the world. The genealogies of the Bible are still for them true in a real sense. And, you know, they still accept that, you know, at least Northern Arabians are Ishmaelites, including the Prophet Muhammad and his followers. And it's really in the middle and towards in the second half of the 19th century when they're starting to think, well, maybe the Bible is not true. You know, maybe the whole genealogy is constructed, and maybe we should rethink everything. And one key figure who I talk about is Alois Sprenger, who's an Austrian figure. I think he was an absolutely incredible intellectual powerhouse. I think I would love if somebody translates his German biography of the Prophet to English, because I think it's still very useful.
I wish you hadn't said that, because I remember going to a used bookshop in Berkeley, and I would pass by, I can't remember the name of one of his works, but I would pass by it all the time. But
Yeah.
you know,
Interesting.
I just became Muslim at the time, so I had a negative view of, you know, non-Muslims studying Islam. But
Right,
you know, I
right.
really wish I had picked it up, because I probably won't find it at any bookshop, especially a used one around here. You know, considering how old it might be. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, you really
You
kind of
probably
just.
won't find that print, but I think some of them have been reprinted, and I ordered some through Amazon, so they may be available. But basically what happens is that, you know, scholars are still, even though they are becoming suspicious of the genealogy as something real, they still think that, well, it was there, it was simply something that the Prophet Muhammad, whom they consider the author of the Quran, that he adopted from the cultural background that he was in. And then Sprenger is, I think, as far as my research pointed me to, I think he was the first person to question this, because he wrote a biography of the Prophet Muhammad uh, in a chronological fashion, using the Gustav Weil's kind of method of dividing the Quran, which was in turn relying on the Islamic tradition itself. And so Sprenger has a 3-volume biography, more than 1,500 pages, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very long biography, definitely more than 1,000 pages. And then as he was going through the Quran chronologically, weaving it with the Sirah, he was like, wait a minute, the earliest references to Abraham do not associate him with Ishmael. That's very curious, isn't it? The earliest references to Abraham mention God giving Isaac and Jacob to him, but they don't say anything about Ishmael. So I think he was the first person to discover that if you sort the Quran based on the alleged chronologies, Abraham and Ishmael are not associated in the earliest references to Abraham. And so, and then he was also like, Abraham is not described as the founder of the Meccan sanctuary in these early passages. So something is going on, something is changing here as we move from the early and the middle Meccan period to the later Meccan period and then the Medinan period. Something is changing. And Abraham is now associated with Ishmael, is now associated with the sanctuary. And so he had his own explanation, which I didn't really feel was very reasonable or tenable, that the prophet had heard about the Ishmaelite ancestry of Arabs from some Christians, but he didn't know that Ishmael himself is Abraham's son, so he kind of mentions Ishmael positively, but does not associate him with Abraham. And then he learns later on that he is Abraham's son, and so he starts mentioning that. So he didn't think that the prophet was the originator of the idea of Ishmaelite descent per se. But he just said that it's not there in the early parts because the prophet didn't really know biblical history well. But later on, he said that the prophet was, in fact, the originator of the idea that Abraham and Ishmael had founded the Meccan sanctuary. Because he just felt that there's no way that Christians would have claimed that, or Jews would have claimed that, because it's just too far away from the Holy Land. So, and it's not there in the early parts of the Quran, so it must have been something that the Prophet Muhammad himself came up with to basically to endow his movement with to basically maybe I would have to say to fill in his movement, to the reverse of the kenosis, instead of filling it in, because it started out as something, in his view, as something abstract and maybe deism, just belief in the one God, and it was great. In Schwenger's estimation, it was great, but then later on, it was filled in with an actual, specific cultic dimension, because you just have to have that for people to follow you. He felt that this was a very expedient thing to do. And I think he was also thinking that this mirrors the development of the Israelite tradition, where they felt 19th century German scholars were really sad about the whole temple thing. They were like, it started out with prophets prophesying about justice and the oneness of God, and then unfortunately the priests took over, and then they just ruined the great religion of ancient Israel. So they had this aversion to these kind of rituals and this way of worship as very good Protestants, and they were also kind of reading some of that into the Quran. But in any case, so this was Sprenger's idea, and then after him, it was really Snooker Gronier's idea, this Dutch scholar's reformulation, that really took over, and everybody just treated as fact, basically, until the 1950s and 60s, basically. And Gronier said, well, yes, there are these references to Abraham and Ishmael in Surah Ibrahim, but they are Medinan insertions into this Meccan surah. In fact, the prophet did not learn of the question of Ishmaelite ancestry and did not come up with the Ishmaelite and Abrahamic attribution of the Meccan sanctuary until the Medinan period. So he had his own reformulation of Sprenger's idea, and then basically this was taken over by everybody after him.
Just because you've just elaborated on the sort of thesis based around the chronology of the Quranic surahs and how these scholars came to that conclusion, we had Johnston on Dr. James Howard Johnston on our channel a few weeks back, and he came to a very similar conclusion based on the chronology of the Quran, particularly in the fact that the Quran fully elaborates on the importance of Abrahamic genealogy to its cultic rights, to its prescribed cultic rights, only in the Medinan surahs. And he has a specific view around the changing of the Qibla, which is not ridiculously far from the scholars that you just talked about. Could you explain to us a little bit, why do you think that the Quran only fully elaborates on the importance of this genealogy to its rights in the Medinan surahs? And what do you think is the significance of the changing of the Qibla in that specific context?
Very good. So let me first say why I think that the association of No, I can answer actually both of them. So I think that it is not the case that the Prophet Muhammad learned about the connection with Ishmael and the Ishmaelite genealogy either towards a later time, or in Medina, a later time in Mecca or in Medina. And I think that there's another explanation for why the early and the middle Meccan surahs, again, if we accept the chronology, why they do not associate Abraham explicitly with Ishmael, or at least don't mention Ishmael as part of, you know, the same kind of patriarchal trio, which is maybe Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as you would find in the Jewish tradition. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's the patriarchs. Why the Quran holds on to that and does not really insert Ishmael into this mix. I think that you could explain this. First of all, I think it doesn't make sense to say that he didn't know about this at all. You know, already in the Meccan period, in fact, most of the Quran's biblical histories appear in the Meccan period, not in the Medinan period. You know, then this notion that the Prophet was clueless and fumbling in the dark, and then he went to Medina, he was enlightened by his correspondence and interactions with the rabbis of Yathrib, I don't think it works if you look at the Quran. In fact, most of the historical content, all the stories of Moses, repeatedly given in the Meccan surahs, the story of Joseph given in the Meccan surah, the stories of David and Solomon given in the Meccan surah, the story of Adam and Eve given in the Meccan surah. So there's so much in the Meccan corpus that it just doesn't work to say that the Prophet didn't know much, and then finally when he went to Yathrib, and you know, he learned these from the rabbis, basically. So that on itself, I think, is just, you know, doesn't work with the Quran if we pay attention to the content. And then the question is, well, why? And second, Ishmael does appear in the Meccan surahs. Like, it's one thing if Ishmael was absent. If Ishmael was not mentioned at all, we would say, you know, perhaps the Quran is just working with, you know, the material from the Jewish tradition that really focuses on the Israelite prophets, that, you know, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their line. And so it doesn't know about Ishmael, it doesn't know about the Ishmaelite ancestry, doesn't mention it. But it does. The Quran actually does mention Ishmael in close proximity to Abraham, you know, never in the early and middle Meccan periods, never with Abraham, but in proximity to him, you know, in the same breath as other Abrahamic peoples of Abraham's progeny in Surah Al-An'am, for example. And so the question is, well, why then does the Quran not associate Ishmael with Abraham explicitly? And I think, so the answer that I give in the paper, and I still stand by it, is that because probably that would have been perceived as something threatening to Jews and Christians, or to the Israelites, the notion that, you know, the idea of chosenness and the kind of patriarchs and the distinguished status of these patriarchs, the notion of inserting Ishmael to that would have been jarring, especially considering the image of Ishmael that I just talked about in Christian and Jewish literature. So what the Quran does is, while revamping the figure of Ishmael and while mentioning him close to Abraham, it doesn't really lay claim to Ishmael as being part of the kind of whole main covenant, or part of the main line of the people whom God chose. But he's very close. And so there's one example which I think is especially interesting, is Surah Sad, which mentions Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from Mustafain al-Akhyar, from people who are chosen and are excellent. And then it mentions Ishmael and two other figures as Akhyar. So they're not Mustafain, they're not chosen, but they are excellent. So and they're, you know, this is the next kind of trio mentioned. So there is, I think, very a tactful approach here. And part of the reason is, I think, that in the Meccan period, especially in the early and middle Meccan period, we can see that the relations between the Prophet Muhammad and his followers and at least some Jewish and Christian individuals is very positive. And they are actually fulfilling a certain function because the Quran says, look, you pagans, you do not believe Muhammad, but actually see these people who know what they're doing are the Israelites or the scholars of the Israelites. They are accepting him. They believe in his scripture. وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدٌ مِّن بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ عَلَى مِثْلِهِ. So there is a witness from the children of Israel who is testifying that the Quran is similar to what they have in the Torah. So they have a, their relations seem to be decent, and the Quran is maybe, not trying to kind of rock the boat. But one thing that I didn't know didn't notice when I was writing the paper, and in the past few years that I've been working on the cultic aspect, I came to notice, which I think further supports this argument, is the question of salat. Now, I've made the argument that salat in the Quran is not just any form of prayer, but rather the Quran uses salat as a sanctuary ritual to refer to a sanctuary ritual, a ritual that is performed ideally by a sanctuary, or at least facing a sanctuary that is functioning. And it's a cultic ritual almost. Maybe it was even accompanied with sacrifices on certain occasions. And basically the Quran suggests that Jews and Christians do not perform salat. And that's an argument I've made in my recent paper, that it asks them to perform salat and zakat, but it's almost saying that they're not doing it. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, it says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةِ وَارْكَعُوا مَعَ الرَّاكِعِينَ. Perform this salat and give the zakat and do the ruku' with those who do it. But it seems like they're not doing it. That's why it's saying do it. And in Surah 5, it says that, Jews and Christians mock the salat of the believers. وَإِذَا نَادَيْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ اتَّخَذُوهَا هُزُوًا وَلَعِبًا. They're mocking it. And then it says, well, do not take them as allies. Take as allies only those who are الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ رَاكِعُونَ, which is very similar to what in Surah 2 we saw. And so salat is something that's almost, a sanctuary ritual. And why does Abraham bring Ishmael by God's sacred house in Surah Ibrahim? لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ. That's what he says. إِنِّي أَسْكَنْتُ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ عِنْدَ بَيْتِكَ الْمُحَرَّمِ رَبَّنَا لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ. I brought them here. لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ. So salat is not, he didn't say, well, we could just, pray towards them, making sanctuary from the Holy Land. No, he really brought them all the way to this inhospitable landscape so that they perform salat. So salat, I think, in the Quran is, again, going with the theme of kenosis. It's been emptied of its specificity, but I think in the Quran it is a very specific thing. Now, I've said all of that to then come to Surah Maryam, because Surah Maryam, in addition to having this very subtle argument against the divinity of Jesus, which is then made explicit perhaps in a later insertion, but having this very subtle argument, I think, that presents Jesus thoroughly as a servant of God, as a prophet of God, but not as the Son of God, not as God, that it emphasizes the sanctuary aspect. First of all, Zechariah is in the sanctuary when the angel speaks to him. He exits فَخَرَجَ عَلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ مِنَ الْمِحْرَابِ. He exits from the mihrab, maybe from the Holy of Holies. And then Maryam is in the sanctuary, apparently, Makanan Sharqiyya. And then when Jesus is born, he says, he announces his commitment to salat and zakat. So, وَأَوْصَانِي بِالصَّلَاةِ وَالزَّكَاةِ مَا دُمْتُ حَيًّا. So God has bid me to do this, salat and zakat. But very interestingly, the surah goes on to talk about other prophets. When it comes to Ishmael, it mentions salat and zakat in relation to Ishmael. So it says, وَكَانَ يَأْمُرُ أَهْلَهُ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَالزَّكَاةِ. So Ishmael used to command his family to observe salat and zakat. And then it goes on to say that unfortunately, after all these great people, all the patriarchal generation and the generation of the prophets, a group have taken over, have succeeded them. فَخَلَفَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ خَلْفٌ أَضَاعُوا الصَّلَاةِ. They have almost abandoned salat, or they have vitiated salat. وَاتَّبَعُوا الشَّهَوَاتِ. So I think this is a very, again, careful argument saying that, well, they don't have a sanctuary anymore, they don't worship there, and they also impute our sanctuary of being a pagan structure, which it is not. But the association of Ishmael with Salat and Zakat here, I think, is very telling in my view. And so it further supports the idea that already in the Meccan period, he is considered associated with the sanctuary, but the argument is not made explicit until the Medinan period, or at least until maybe the late Meccan period, if we accept the Surah Ibrahim passage goes back to the late Meccan period, because it's really the relations with the Jews start to change, the idea that they are, that the believers are pagans, or at least they're doing pagan rituals by performing the rites of the sanctuary, that becomes something that they are raising. And so in defense of that, and to make sure that the defense is solid, then the Quran elaborates on the Abrahamic and Ishmaelite background to the sanctuary.
So what do you make of the Islamic, or what do you make of the Islamic reports that the Kaaba before Islam was also a shrine to the polytheistic god Hubal? And might this impact the notion that the Kaaba was already an Abrahamic shrine? I know this one might be a bit of a curveball because I thought of it after we submitted our questions to you, but I only thought of it after.
Fine. No, it's a good question. So I do not know, so having said all of that, I do not know to what extent the Kaaba was considered an Abrahamic or Ishmaelite sanctuary before Islam. I don't know. I think it's possible that the idea was there, but the idea was there. How exactly? I don't know. How many people felt that? I don't know. It could also be that the Quran is the first text to talk about the Kaaba as an Abrahamic and Ishmaelite sanctuary. But already, it could be that this was something that the Prophet believed in already in the Meccan period. My point is that it's not, my point is that the genealogical, my point is that the claim that the Prophet and his followers are Ishmaelites is certainly not just a Medinan construct. That I would certainly stand by. And that even the their association with the Meccan sanctuary is probably not just exclusive to Medina. But I don't know if it is certainly, before Islam, it was there. It might have been there. It might have been, some people believe that, but it might also be that, it was not there at all. I don't know that. We just don't have any evidence that it was, or at least that it was a widespread belief. Of course, we have very little evidence about anything before Islam when it comes to Mecca. Now, the shrine being associated with Hubal, that's a very curious claim that the tradition makes. Hubal of all people. So not Lat, not Uzza, not Manat, but Hubal. It's like, where does Hubal come from? And as far as we can tell from poetry, and you have pointed to Peter Webb's study, I think, in your previous interviews, which is a very good study. And Nikolai Sinai also has a study that actually adumbrates some of the conclusions of Peter Webb. It's Allah in Pre-Islamic Poetry, Rain Giver, Bone Breaker, Score Settler, which is a fantastic study. Of course, it's not surprising. Nikolai Sinai, all of his studies are fantastic, but that's the one that I really like. And so he also shows that already before Islam, probably Allah was the patron deity of the Meccan sanctuary. So Allah is the patron deity, not Hubal. So I don't know where Hubal comes from. And it seems that when we think about the poetry, and also we put the inscriptions next to it, that it might be that there was no, I don't know, Hubal was not really a deity associated with the sanctuary at all.
Mm.
It might be that there were already kind of a quasi-monotheistic way of worship, but they were not strict enough. And so the Quran, brings this strict monotheism with it, and criticizes the worship of all sorts of maybe spirits or maybe angels, in addition to Allah, and says you have to worship only Allah. Yeah, so I don't know I don't know if there was at all a cult of Hubal to begin with. And I don't know if that kind of answers your question or if I missed part of it.
No. That pretty much answers it. I mean, and you also mentioned epigraphy and poetry. I do want to know, I mean, according to Webb, onomastic and epigraphic findings suggest that evidence of Arabs of Ishmaelite ancestry appears mainly in the northern part of Arabia, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, outside of Palestine in the area of Transjordan and Syria. In terms of pre-Islamic poetry, I haven't read all of the poetry, but he's saying that there's no mention of Hijazi Arabs anchoring their identity along Abrahamic or Ishmaelite lines. This raises questions about the first audience of the Prophet Muhammad and what they understood of their ancestry, as well as how the Hajj and the Kaaba were conceptualized prior to Islam, as you just touched on. So my question is this. Do you think the onomastic data, epigraphic evidence, and pre-Islamic poetry can fully answer whether the Prophet Muhammad was the first to claim that the Quraysh were descendants of Abraham and Ishmaelites, along with the origins of the Kaaba and its association with Abraham and Ishmael?
Excellent question. I think presently it cannot, because we just, when we almost have to prove a negative. It's almost like the question that Roxana asked about, could the Quran be preserving, in speaking positively about Ishmael, preserving a positive discourse about him already in the pre-Islamic period? We can never answer that in the negative, because it's always possible that there's something in the sources that we haven't discovered, it was lost and we just don't have this anymore. So we're faced with evidence, with the absence of evidence, which is not the evidence of absence. So the same thing, I would say, applies to the inscriptions and the poetry, in the sense that they do have the absence of evidence. And it's an important point to recognize that whether we're looking at epigraphy or whether we're looking at poetry, or even looking at the genealogical works that the Islamic tradition preserves for us about pre-Islam, because the genealogical literature may also be something that's, at least to some extent, authentic, just like the poetic corpus. And it doesn't really, there's no evidence that people named themselves like biblical names in general, including Abraham and Ishmael. Now, poetry is in general, it doesn't really have much reference to biblical matters. We have some in the poetry attributed to, let's say, Ali ibn Zayd or Umayyah ibn Abi Salt. By the way, the first person to draw attention to Umayyah ibn Abi Salt was, can you guess?
The first to bring attention to the poet.
Umayyah ibn Abi
Okay,
Salt.
wait, no, ask your question again. Ask your question again.
Sorry. So the first person to bring attention to Umayyah was Sprenger. That's what I was trying to say.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
Sprenger was
that.
the first person to draw attention, and the first person to say that in the genealogical literature we don't find the names Abraham and Ishmael was also Sprenger. This guy it was just incredible. So yeah, we don't have in poetry any sign that Ishmaelite or Abrahamic descent was there. Now, the absence from the kind of onomastic record is a little bit tricky, because even if people thought generally that, at least outsiders called them Ishmaelites, considered them descendants of Ishmael, and I think that's perfectly possible. That doesn't mean that they were then going to adopt this very consciously, or even name their children after it. Naming patterns tend to be conservative, as I point to in my paper. Even after Islam, it takes a while for these biblical names to be picked up when it comes to the epigraphic record, we do have the name or variants of the name Ishmael, actually, both in the north and the south. We have, I think, 100 instances, in fact, mostly in Safavidic, but some in South Arabian inscriptions as well. But we don't know if this is the biblical Ishmael, because, you know, the theophoric names ending in il, you know, appear in Safavidic or in other languages, Semitic languages. You know, we have, I don't know, Garm il, or Nasr-il or something. So Yisma'il could be just another theophoric name that was independently used by these people. In fact, it's possible that the Bible, the writers of the Bible, used the name Ishmael because maybe some people living in modern-day Jordan claimed that their ancestor is named Ishmael. You know, maybe that's how they drafted them to the family tree that they were coming up with. So, but there's no sign that the Safavidic inscriptions or the South Arabian, I think it's Minaic inscriptions largely, that they are using the biblical Ishmael, because there is no, as far as I know, none of those inscriptions have a sign of being, you know, written by Jews or Christians, or they don't say, I don't know, Yisma'el bar, I don't know, David, something. We say, okay, this is a multiple kind of reference to biblical names, and so it's likely to be Ishmael. No, it's usually Yisma'el appears to be the only biblical name when it appears in one of the inscriptions, one of these nearly 100 inscriptions. So, so yes, there is really no evidence, and I think that speaks to the fact that it was probably not a big part of people's self-identity. So that is, I think, reasonable to conclude that, generally speaking, the people of Mecca, probably the people of Yathrib, Ta'if, they did not generally, maybe they knew that people called them Ishmaelites, maybe some of them thought that we could be Ishmaelites, but that this was not a big part of their identity.
Just to add on to that, one thing that's quite interesting is to try and figure out, or at least get your best idea as to whether you think what you think the scope of the Quran's genealogical claims exactly are, because this is quite inclusive. Does it include all Arabians? Is it just the Hijazis? Is it the Meccans? Is it just the Quraysh? What exactly is the Quran claiming?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to, because you know, I mean, on the face of it, you would say that to claim the Meccans are, at least the Meccans, or at least the people of Quraysh, like that's the bare minimum that we have to say, because when the Quran is saying, you know, the prophet is an Ishmaelite, is sent to Ishmaelites, and at least he was sent initially to the people of Mecca. Now, we know that where was the maybe original base of Abraham and Ishmaelite communities? It was in the areas to the southeast of Palestine, the province of Arabia and the northern Hijaz, that were considered the land of Ishmael by people before the Quran. So on that note, we might say, by claiming that the Meccans are Ishmaelites, this was not a claim that the only Meccans are Ishmaelites, but that, you know, at least from the Holy Land to Mecca, this was, you know, Ishmaelite land, an Ishmaelite bubble, as I call it in the paper. But on the other hand, the Quran in Surah 14 and also in Surah 2, and even I would say in Surahs 3 and 5, when it speaks about the temple, the Quran claims that Abraham brought Ishmael to God's sacred house. So the Quran envisions Abraham to have brought Ishmael here. If we identify this with the Kaaba, by the way, some people don't identify with the Kaaba. I think we should, because it just creates too many problems if we don't. But if we do identify with the Kaaba, the Quran is not is claiming that Abraham brought Ishmael really right by God's sacred house. So in that sense, it is still conceivable, even though we know that the original home, at least from the perspective of Jews and Christians, would have been southeast of Palestine and the Sinai Peninsula. It's not inconceivable that the Quran would be envisioning primarily Meccans as descendants of Ishmael. So it could go any way. I don't know, honestly. I think it's not quite clear from the Quran, but I think you could say that because in Surah Al-Baqarah, this is a Medinan surah, because Surah Al-Baqarah really presents the Prophet and his followers as Ishmaelites, and they were already there with the Ansar, so maybe even the Ansar thought of themselves, or at least could think of themselves as Ishmaelites. So it could go, you know, multiple ways. I don't know, but that's a really important question.
At the beginning of your article, you mentioned if the preaching of Muhammad were aimed at a clearly delineated community, one might reason it would not have appealed to vastly different societies from every corner of the world. Considering that Islam ultimately appealed and continues to appeal to a wide range of people, my question is, so what triggered the shift to a more universalist, ecumenical interpretation of Islam, and how do we reconcile the Quran's universalist message with its specific emphasis on Abrahamic descent?
So I myself, if I were to read the Quran and extract a coherent theology from it, with the assumption that it goes back to the same author and it's not the work of multiple people, as some scholars would say, I would say that the way to reconcile the universal aspects with the particularistic aspects is to say, you know, the Quran envisions Abraham and his family, his children, to be leaders or paragons, imams, as he's called in Surah 2, or in Surah Al-An'am also, وَجَعَلْنَاهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا. So they are imams and paragons. Yes, they are the primary recipients of scripture. And yes, scripture comes in their language, but they still have this responsibility to share their knowledge and gifts with everyone. You know, we could hardly expect God to reveal a comprehensive scripture in every available language on the whole surface of the earth. So he decided to, you know, treat Abraham's children especially, but that was not just, you know, favoritism, because also their responsibilities raised. So it's not exactly great to be elected, at least in the Quranic, with the Quranic kind of assumptions. And so yes, it is primarily addressing Ishmaelites and maybe secondarily Israelites, but also in a tertiary way, it is addressing you know, at least conceiving that it could have relevance for a broader audience. And you know, this is something that, you know, I mean, happens to us all the time. I don't know if you go to, I don't know, the Twitter page of these politicians, you know, it's very common to say, you know, this is how they have it in their bio: dad, husband, representative of this district, American. What does that mean? Well, it means that, you know, I see my primary responsibility, I have responsibility in the first instance and primarily to my children, and then to my wife, and then to the people of my district, and then as an American, of course, I care about Americans. So you know, it can be all of these, but we should also not think that the distinctions have to be obliterated. Like we shouldn't think that we either have a thoroughly universalist perspective or a thoroughly particularist perspective. They can coexist, and there can be some sort of hierarchy. So I think it's possible to say that when it comes to the Quran. And certainly the God of the Quran is a very universal God. There's no question about that. He's not the God of a specific people. On the other hand, what's really interesting is that most of the very explicitly universalist descriptions of the Quran or the Prophet appear actually in Meccan surahs and not in Medinan surahs. So when the Quran is described as dhikrun lil alameen, a reminder for people, creatures in general, the inhabitants of the world in general, or the Prophet Muhammad is described as rahmatan lil alameen. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. A mercy for the inhabitants of the world. These are Meccan passages usually, and in the Medinan texts, there's more, because maybe there is now actually in the phase of implementation and dealing with the community, it's more geared towards the specific communities with whom the Quran is dealing with. So I think it's possible to have some sort of hierarchy. What I would say, though, about the notion of a kind of global militancy, because that's what I found especially jarring in the study of Fred Donner, where he says, they were intent almost from the kind of beginning of spreading the rule of God's law on earth. So that's the corollary of a universal message for him. And I just don't think that's tenable when we think about, the Medinan period, a very small settlement group of people who are, fighting for their survival. And to have that kind of global ambition, I just don't see that being very reasonable. But the other reason that I think is really kind of speaks against this, and I've written about it partly in one of my recent studies, is that I think most of the fighting in the Quran is geared towards the Meccan sanctuary. They are fighting for the Meccan sanctuary to be able to worship at the Meccan sanctuary, to access the Meccan sanctuary, and then to keep the Meccan sanctuary, to cleanse it of pagan presence. So a lot of the fighting, if you think even about Surah Al-Baqarah itself, a lot of the fighting passages appear in Surah Al-Baqarah, which also talks about the sanctuary, and also Surah Al-Hajj, which again talks about the sanctuary. So even if you look at the Quran, I think the collocation of fighting and sanctuary is there, and it's a holy war in the path of Allah, because Allah is the patron deity of the Meccan sanctuary. So I think I would definitely push back against the idea that there was this kind of global vision of world conquest from the beginning because of that universal message.
I mean, just to end and sort of cap this discussion, what further research do you think is needed to better understand the role of genealogy in the Quran, and how do you see maybe a focus on that theme contributing to our broader understanding of its narrative and also the historical context of Islam's emergence? Is this going to be a feature of your book? Could you talk to us a little bit about your upcoming book?
I think one way in which studies on genealogy could be advanced is by looking more closely to the hadith literature and to all sorts of akhbar or riwayat or reports from the first couple of centuries of Islam, because we do know that initially when the Prophet's followers venture out, they conquer lands in the Fertile Crescent, and then even further on, that they're not thinking of their movement as something that it wants everybody to join them. They build their own towns and garrison cities, and they're not even particularly happy that others would join them, because that has tax implications. And so, if others want to join, they have to become mawla, they have to become clients of them. You don't have this kind of, there's a hierarchy. So Islam, in a way, is something that you can't just join. It's not yet universal, really, in its membership criteria. And so I think one thing that could really help us is to look both in the hadith and also in the historical reports that we have to see if we can see any change, when is the change happening? You know, I have a kind of rough guess. Maybe it's towards the Caliphate of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, towards the late Umayyad period. But what exactly happens? How do conceptions of who can be a member of this community change? Because if we find that in fact it is in the year, I don't know, 75 that it's changing, then we can all the more so say that in the Quran, this is not seen as something that you know, just would apply to everybody regardless of their status, regardless of their background. So that's a possibility. Of course, the challenge with that is that oftentimes it's hard to go back that early to the first century because our sources are from the second and third century. So there is challenges to that, but maybe there's ways of kind of breaking through using, you know, Isnad analysis and math analysis, as some scholars do. And then the legal hadith also can help. I mentioned that, you know, the notion of Christians being Israelites is something that is absolutely preposterous to us. But I think it's at least there in some Quranic passages. And it's also, it's not just exclusively the Quranic. In some of the hadith collections, we find similar things. So there's these hadiths about, can we eat the meat of Arab Christians? This is one of the questions that arises. Can we eat the meat of Arab Christians? And you know, the Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah tells us, وَطَعَامُ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ حِلٌّ لَكُمْ. The food of the people of the book is allowed for you, permissible for you. So can we eat the meat of the Arab Christians, Nasara Taghlib, you know, the tribe of Taghlib? And so some of the answers are that no, you can't, because the real Nasara are the Israelites, and these people are not Israelites, and they have joined them, but they don't have all their traditions of, you know, how to slaughter properly and so on. So they're not real Christians. You know, Arab Christians are quasi-Christian, but they're not real because they're not Israelites. So, you know, that kind of seems to support that at least some people in the early period still continue to believe that real Christians are Israelites. You know, they have to be descended from Israelite communities. And so, you know, that sort of thing could maybe give us some information also about genealogy. I don't know if for my book I'll be able to look at that. But maybe I should, you know, maybe I should try. I don't know if maybe that's something worth doing. I know that to some extent, Reuven Firestone has looked at in some aspects of exegesis of the story of the sacrifice, for example. But I don't think somebody has done a kind of comprehensive study of Ishmael and genealogy in the early biblical genealogy in the early Hadith corpus. So that would be worthwhile doing, I think.
Somebody's upcoming dissertation, hopefully.
Yes.
All right. On that note, we thank you for joining us on our platform. This was a really interesting discussion, and one that was of particular interest to me after reading Webb's article on the Hajj before Islam or in the time of Muhammad, where I read that, you know, there really wasn't any mention of Abraham, Ishmael, the Kaaba, pre-Islamic poetry, and epigraphy, and that just totally threw my mind for a loop. And then Roxana, after I believe I shared one of your articles with her, the one that you did, you gave an interview with Gabriel Said Reynolds on, Dean, and everybody knows that you can go find it on his Academia EDU page. Then she shared with me the article on the Ascent of Ishmael because she knew that I was interested in the topic. And I was like, wow, this totally brings a different perspective than what I assumed from reading Webb's book. So, you know, we thank you for joining us, accepting our invitation. It was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Let me just say at the end that my kind of thesis in the article does not really contradict Webb's conclusions. It's just because he's not talking about the Quran, you know, he's talking about the poetry. And so my point is really whether it's already there in the Meccan period or not. And so I'm kind of silent on the pre-Quranic phase, for which I take Webb's study. I think it's a fantastic study. So no disagreement there.
All right. Is there anything that you would like to share with us before you leave? Where can we find more of your work if anyone wanted to reach out to you for questions concerning your work?
Yes, so I have uploaded those papers that I put on academia, but if somebody wants to read a study that is not posted fully, I'm happy to, they can send me an email and I'm happy to share it with them.
All right. And we look forward to your upcoming book. Do we know exactly when it's coming out, or is it still in the process of?
It is still in the process of the draft being finalized, but it's not up hopefully too far. I'm hoping that maybe in a year and a half,
Okay.
inshallah, it will be out.
I
All
hope
right.
you'll
Well, we
be able
look
to
forward
ask
to
you
it.
back.
Yeah, and then give us a reason to ask you back. Even unless you write another very interesting article. I mean, some of your articles are very lengthy, so they're like several chapters of a book already.
Yeah.
So who knows? You might write something.
Apologies. Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and hope we speak again.
You too. Take care.